I'm ready for my brain to kind of melt a little bit because I feel like I know just enough to be dangerous when it comes to consumer insights, but I also know that you've probably forgotten more about it than I will ever know. And that's
No, not
that's what's going to
true.
make this so
No, but
fun.
actually knowing a little bit to be dangerous is exactly where we are in the industry. And we're going to go into, we'll touch on that in the future. But first, I want to talk about consumer research and the interesting challenge that it has is that it, I would argue it is the most important function for all of our companies to have. But it is most likely the most under resourced of all of the different functions that are out there. So let me sort of back that up. I know that's a big statement, and everybody's like, "Oh, consumer research." Well, I don't know. We don't need consumer research, but it is vital. But let me start with a question, Aaron. What? Why do companies exist? What is the goal of a company?
Oh, that's a big question, man. I mean, ultimately, I think it's to bring something into the world and offer it up to the people that they care most about.
Yes, and what does that stuff do for people that they bring?
Solves problems in most
Yes,
cases.
exactly. And
Yes.
you know, and that's what consumer research is. Consumer research is the tool or function that helps identify what the problem is that consumers have that brands can come into the marketplace and create a solve for either through a product or an experience or a service to be able to sell to them. In other words, it solves the jobs to be done for people. Um, and so I actually want to go. I'm going to take a total left turn right from the start.
Perfect.
It's kind of like hero's journey. Are you familiar with the hero's journey?
Oh yeah, extremely. Joseph
Okay.
Campbell. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so, for those listeners that are out there that aren't familiar with the hero's journey, the hero's journey is a literary narrative where there is a main character, and that main character is somewhat disenfranchised with the world that they currently live in. And as they're sort of seeking their sort of growth, typically from some being young to a little bit older, a mentor comes in, and that mentor gives them tools and gives them advice, and then sends them on a journey to overcome some sort of obstacle. And when they do so, they become the hero of their own story. And this plays out a lot. I know Dylan gave you a little bit of shit uh, for reading sci-fi or fantasy. I also read sci-fi or fantasy. Have you been reading? Have you read The Hobbit or seen The Hobbit
Oh,
or
absolutely. Yeah.
the Lord of the Rings?
Yep.
Let's talk about Lord of the Rings. Let's do an example. So who is the main character in Lord of the Rings?
Frodo, right? Or
Frodo.
okay,
Exactly,
yeah.
Frodo Baggins. And where do you remember where he's living?
in
Um,
the Shire.
in the Shire. He's
Yep.
all peaceful, calm, but he feels this restless need to go do something else. And along comes a mentor. And who is his mentor?
Gandalf.
Gandalf the Grey. Yes. And Gandalf gives him something. What does he give him?
The ring.
The ring,
Mhm.
exactly. He gives him advice. The advice is a little hard, so I'm going to tell you. He says, "Keep it secret, keep it safe," and that's the advice. And he sends Frodo on a journey to do what? What does Frodo have to do?
He has to throw it into a volcano.
Yes, and overcome the obstacle. Who's trying to find him and stop him?
Oh, it's blanking.
Sauron,
Sauron.
Sauron, the
Yep.
big eye in the
Yeah.
sky. And so this is an amazing narrative, and he goes on this journey. He ends up throwing it in, and he ends up becoming the hero of his own journey. And now this applies to companies as well. And so let's think of Nike, for example, and Elliot Kipchoge in the sort of the hero's journey of breaking two. So Nike was the mentor to Elliot as he was trying to be sort of the fastest marathoner on the planet and break two. And in order to do so, if people aren't familiar with it, Nike created the next percent or 4% shoe that was basically carbon plated that helped them run faster. They also gave them advice in order to be able to be fast on the track. So, what is the sort of formation they need to be in? What kind of training should you be doing, etc. And so he ended up breaking two. He did not break two, but he ended up being the fastest marathon time ever, which is amazing. And that's just an example of how companies operate to help people become heroes of their own journey. Their job is to create the tools and services to help them do that. Now, this comes back to consumer research in that in order to understand what tools to give them, or in order to understand what services to provide them, you need to understand that consumer. And so, from the very beginning of the process of product creation, you have to truly understand what that challenge is. And as you take it through, all the way through that product creation, the consumer decides at the end. So they're the ones that choose to buy this product. So it's vital that consumer research is sort of part of organizations. And so let's step back a little bit from our industry, and let's look at other industries that have consumer research. And I'll sort of call out CPG companies to start. So um, this would be things like Procter Gamble, General Mills, anything that's in a, so let's say, a grocery store, for example, which is a good parallel to what we produce.
Okay,
They
wait,
are,
time out
yeah,
for fun.
yeah, go for it.
So the consumer insight potentially for the Breaking Two project was that people are trying to get faster, and as a way to inspire and create this aspirational moment, they developed an innovation to put the fastest shoes out there, and then worked with Elliot to kind of put that into the world. Is that
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
just making
the
sure I'm
insight
following along.
feeds, exactly. The insight feeds the product creation. It feeds that service. It actually fed the whole idea of that marketing campaign, because it ended up being a marketing campaign.
And everybody
Um,
had those shoes after that because they wanted to be faster.
exactly. But let's take a current commercial that we're seeing in the marketplace, and we could take several. But On just launched their commercial with Kermit the Frog, and
Elmo.
Elmo. Sorry, soft wins is the idea. Um, and you can see the idea that they're trying to push that there's an insight that consumers have, that running is hard, running sucks. And I say that it was a funny ad campaign that I worked on at Nike a long time ago. But the At the end of the day, people want run. Some people want running to be fun, right? Like, they want to enjoy the run, and in order to do that, they're looking for comfort. Um, and so, in order to sort of help create that, they created footwear that is ultra plush in order to have that soft ride, not necessarily fast, but soft. And they're sort of promoting that through commercials that talks about soft wins. Etc. And so that's another, so you can see it coming to play in that. And I'm happy to do other commercials too if you want. But that's how insights help drive or understand or feed the process.
So walk me through how you would get to that point. Like if you are leading insights and you run a business called Insight Accelerator, which does exactly that. What's kind of the high level of how do you go from, are you confirming something that the brand thinks, like here are the things that we think probably match up to us, help us find out if this is the right target to start with, or do they kind of give you like, hey, what do people care about? Like how does insight really come together, and how do you get to that point where they're like, all right, sounds good, we're going to go to Sesame Street and license Elmo and deal with all the fun uphill stuff there because it matches the consumer insight that we now have. We have this piece of data and now we're going to like use it for all it's worth. How do you get to that point where then the brand is spending resources against really building out a campaign against it?
Sure. So there are lots of actually different ways in, but it all leads to sort of a central location. Some of the ways in is, sometimes you feel like your business is flagging. You're not doing terribly well. Like, sales aren't what you project they're going to be. That's one place that you sort of see it. And another place is you've been working with consumers, and you say it's in the running space, and you've been tracking and following sort of individual runners for a while, but all of a sudden there's an upsurgence in run clubs, and you're like, hey, I'm not familiar with who these run club people are. That's different than what we've been targeting. I want to make sure I understand who this new group of runners is. And so, if there's been an evolution in a sport, that's oftentimes where we see people come in. Other times is exactly where we are, especially in the outdoor industry, is when you're starting to see the marketplace as a sea of sameness. So all the product looks the same. Everybody has the same innovation. Nobody's standing out and nobody's being different. That is a time that you need consumer research. And so, as you sort of look at these different ways in, you can, oftentimes people have hypotheses on what's changed or what's different, but they have not been confirmed. The danger is not confirming them. So just going off of gut all of the time can become hard because companies are set up. If let's step back as a as a founder, oftentimes people will talk about not doing research. I didn't do any research. I sort of created this product, like this is what I needed, etc. But that is consumer research. Like they are typically founders are people who are out in the doing the activity that are so engaged. They're like power users. They know where different brands aren't filling a gap, and they sort of create something to fill the gap, which is great. The hard part is that's they're able to solve for one product, but in order to be a company for the long term, you need to be scalable and repeatable over time, and that's very hard for brands. And what you oftentimes see, brands that don't do this become one hit wonders, and they have one great product, they're around for a bit, and then they sort of disappear because they can't find what that next innovation is, where to drive next. So all of this to say, you end up creating this hypothesis about what's there, and then based on that hypothesis, you go perform consumer research, or you go perform cultural immersions in order to understand what is the underlying element of that's driving the consumer. And maybe this is a good place to take a pause too and talk about the difference between an observation and an insight. And we're starting to get really deep, really quickly, but a lot of times where you see people and when you go do research, you go get observations, which is something somebody says or does, etc. It's a very tactical thing. It could be a statistic. And insight is a deeper, richer understanding of who that consumer is. Now, both of these things are value. Actually, insight is built off of observations, but the observation helps us with incremental change, like little changes. So like let's say you have a piece of footwear and you're evolving it from the 37 to the 38. Little observations can help you make that better. Like I need a different lace so the laces stay tied. That's an observation. But the deeper, richer understanding is what leads to innovation and leads people to new places. Do you want to go through an example?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. So our uh, I don't know if everybody's familiar with what an ATC is in rock climbing, but it's called air traffic controls, what it stands for. But it's what people were using, let's say 15 years ago, when rock climbing, it's a belay device. And so basically the rope goes from the climber down to you and it goes to this device. And then you hold on to the other end of the rope. And if the climber falls, the person uses their brake hand to sort of create enough friction that they can sort of catch the climber as they fall, and so they don't sort of land on the ground. And so the interesting thing is the observations that you sort of have when people were using the RTCs, especially when new, is that uh, the people that were belaying were incredibly stressed. Like you would see them white knuckling, holding onto that rope because they knew if the person fell off, like their life was in their hands,
Literally in their
literally,
hands.
right? And so if we saw that as a researcher and you see it as just an observation, if you needed to solve that problem, I probably would give people Xanax so that they weren't so stressed about when people fell, right? Like you're solving the immediate need of the stress. But if you dive deeper into what the insight is, in which you sort of brought up, is that um, belayers were stressed while belaying their climber because if they let go of the rope, the climber could die. And so that creates a very different perspective that we could solve. So we create what we call a how might we? How might we create a device that if you let go of the rope would still catch the person? And if you're familiar with rock climbing, that is how Petzl created the Gree, which is an automatic braking device. And so if you let go, it automatically brakes and it catches them and it relieves the stress of everybody. And so that's the difference between an insight and an observation, is that insight actually will lead you to that innovative place. It takes you to someplace new. And most of the time we're dealing in observations, and again, they're helpful, but research really helps you take you to that insight portion, which is important.
So an observation would have made you probably make the ATC lighter, better material, maybe a set of gloves to go with it so you could grip tighter on the thing. But the insight is how could we completely flip this into something that solves a problem and creates a new product as well?
Exactly. And so let's continue forward back to what we were talking about before, where we're talking about CPG. The General Mills, Procter and Gamble has 1,000 consumer research folks, right? Like market researchers. They're in a highly competitive industry that's high volume, low price, and the way to compete is to understand the consumer and capture that consumer. Now, when we sort of trickle down to our industry does tend to sit 10 years, 15, 20 behind a lot of where CPG has been. We tend to not have that. And the reason why is because most of us do come from that founder side. Like we are participants and we feel like we know it. And if you had an extra dollar to spend, you're most likely going to spend that in a place that you can see the return, which is like likely marketing, where a lot of the work that we do is throughout the process. And I'll define what consumer research is probably after this, but um, it's hard to attribute growth or innovation based on the consumer research because product comes in and takes credit, which is really important. Product is amazing. Marketing comes in and takes credit, and that's also incredibly important and valuable. But it all stems from this initial idea that from the research side of the problem that we're solving. And so it's hard to have that attribution back to research, but it is the fundamental difference that sort of creates that change um, throughout the organization.
I'd love to hear your definition of consumer insight. And then I'd also love for you to talk about the different ways that you gather that kind of insight. Like, what are the different approaches to the whole thing?
Yeah. And so let's talk about consumer insights. I'm going to bubble it up to market research is often the term that people use out there. So if you've heard of market research, that's sort of that same term, but I will call it consumer insight or consumer research for now, as a proxy, just to help. So consumer research is actually covers a lot of different things. I think people have in their mind consumer research is reading customer reviews or it's only talking to people. But hopefully, it can help expand everybody's thinking that consumer research runs the gambit from understanding macro trends that are happening with consumers in the marketplace. It can be micro trends that are occurring. So, what are these big cultural shifts we need to be aware of so that it takes 2 years to produce product, we know where the consumer is going to be in those 2 years so we can actually land them in the right place. Then it moves on to more of what I will call qual quant research, which is understanding who the consumer is to help drive, honestly, product creation and marketing that's there. And qual quant would be qual is the going out and talking to people in in-depth interviews, ethnographies, etc. Really cultural immersions, getting to understand that consumer. Um, those type of conversations are an inch wide, mile deep, where surveys are kind of the opposite, where it's about quantifying how many people have this challenge or how many people have this problem. And that's a sort of an inch deep, mile wide. So it basically surveys lots of people and proves that problems exist. And then, sort of as you go through the go to market process, consumer research continues to play a role. And that can be either through user experience, or product experience, what it's like to actually be hands on with the product and being in sort of engaged with it. What problems are people having with it? What's the shopping journey that people have and they go through, all the way through, how did sort of different products perform in the marketplace? And what are those competitive threats and opportunities and white spaces to fill? And it actually becomes sort of a circle that you can then take that information and then circle it back up to product at the end of the day. So it covers a lot of spectrum for people. And it's funny, I hear a lot of founders that I talk to, they're like, we don't need research. We go off of like what we know about the consumer and we're taking everybody new. And the reality is they're using consumer research. They just happen to be using it differently. Like they keep thinking consumer research is that product testing. Granted, sure, you don't need that. But what you are actually referencing when you create your sort of your mood boards, those are actually trends that you're sort of looking at and tracking, and you're playing into those trends. So consumer research does have a role at every company, but just different types of consumer research.
Can I tell you a story about how consumer research completely melted the brains of every single person at Red Bull?
Yeah, go for it.
It broke people, I think, honestly, because to your point, that qual research, we had a really strong field marketing team, and they are talking to the movers and shakers in every single one. And Red Bull had been telling itself a story for basically since its inception. This is a premium product. It costs more than all the competitors. And so, because of that, a very specific consumer is going out and buying Red Bull. And there are two different kinds of consumers out in the market. There are people that can afford and buy Red Bull because it's a premium product. And there are people who can't afford Red Bull and they buy Monster. And there is not really any overlap in that Venn diagram other than just sort of this random mix of stuff. And Monster speaks to the people that really care about motorsports and here doing like culture and really high level this and that. And we do not overlap at all. And there became this consumer insights gathering where they brought everybody together and they're like, hey, actually, the Venn diagram overlap is 98%. Most of your consumers, people that buy Red Bull, also buy Monster. People don't really care, actually. And, yeah, if you had a different flavor, they might try that one or this one. In fact, adding the different flavored Red Bulls was also related to that because they realized the number one barrier to entry into the category or into the brand was that people didn't like the flavor. And so, like, whoa, wait, we can solve a big problem by adding flavor. But that moment where they're like, actually, there's no differentiation hardly at all between people that are, in fact, loyalty in this space does not exist in the way that you thought it did, completely broke everybody's brains.
But how valuable is that information, right? Like, how
Yeah.
valuable is it knowing that? And I
Oh,
think we love to go off of gut, right? Like we believe something, we believe firmly in it, and then when you actually get that reality, it's really valuable. A couple analogies I keep thinking about. It's almost like you're at a restaurant and um, companies without consumer research. It's like they're making meals and they may be great meals and they give people these meals, but they don't ask them what meals they actually want. So the consumer some of them may get things that they love, but some may not get what they love. Why not go and ask the consumer what do they want for their meal and then go make them what they want? It's that simple, right? And in doing so, it solves a lot of problems. The other analogy that I tend to use is that it's almost like being a doctor. And if there's a challenge or something that's wrong or something you don't know, hopefully you don't just start taking all these different medications to solve it. I mean, you take some Advil and stuff like that. You try to figure it out yourself. But if it persists, like you got to go to the doctor. The doctor's going to understand and take a look and identify where the problem is in order to help address. And consumer research doesn't always answer what it answers where the challenge is, not always how to solve that challenge. And that's where strategy comes in, and product comes in, and design comes in, and it becomes a team and a partnership in order to do that. And the interesting two thing, maybe a Red Bull too, is that the the hard part that everybody has, I would say, in our industry, is that they nobody's been trained to do consumer research. Yet, if you're a marketing person, a designer, if you're a merchant, if you're in product, you are going out in field and talking to consumers. But if you go out into field, you may not have had that training in order to know like what are best practices, what are not best practices, and how might you be biasing the responses that are there in order to get the most effective communication. And honestly, that's why I teach at the University of Oregon is to help these students sort of enter the industry with that foundation. It's the class I really wanted and probably needed before getting into the industry, 20 years ago. Uh, but that's a role that we can sort of help play because these organizations are becoming more and more consumer centric. They're not necessarily hiring big consumer research teams. They're requiring all of their other functions to be able to perform this consumer research effectively.
I feel like a lot of people listening are probably like, this is insane to get this level of detail. And I can imagine exactly how this would impact my business and sort of my thought process, and also how I tell stories when I'm pitching for projects or pitching for budget or utilizing these pieces of data to really step change what we can do as an organization. But also, I feel like a lot of people, I'm sure that a lot of them would love to hire, your Insight Accelerator to help them get that kind of stuff. But are there things that everybody could do to just start formalizing this or start tracking in this direction? What are the questions they could be asking, or what are the little things that they could do to start like building a little bit of process in place? Is there a way to do that without bringing in like an entire category of
Of
insights?
people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like you could start small, start easy. Um, One, start monitoring if you're leading with your thoughts with opinions versus what you know about the consumer. Like if you go into a meeting and you're like the consumer should have I believe this. If you're using the word believe or we need to do this, like that to me is that's a red flag. We should The voice of the consumer should be coming out first. The consumer is looking for this. The consumer needs this. Those are very different conversation. It takes sort of the opinion out of organizations, and it starts to put that consumer centricity first. Um, and so to have that, you you're going to start to create those hypotheses or questions to understand the consumer. Like, what do we know? What do we not know? And so as you start to face decisions, and if you're feeling uncomfortable about how you think a consumer may react, that's where you're going to want to start to engage with consumers and try to understand sort of that underlying mechanism that's happening. And that oftentimes for us comes together in a learning agenda. So we look sort of over the next 2 to 3 quarters and say, all right, what are the key decisions that need to be made? What hypotheses do we have, or what questions do we need to answer, and then potentially a little bit of how we might solve them. It could be done through desk research. We could see what smart participation is doing in running, for example, or it could be going and talking to consumers, or an immersion. You can start to map out what you need at each of these points, and simply in doing so, it's going to create visibility. What I find is the biggest tension is getting people from that first phase of like, I don't quite know, but I'm going to go anyway, to actually doing a little bit of planning. That little bit of planning goes a long way. You're like, all right, um, it's not this huge problem. I don't need a million people to solve this. I just need to go talk to like 10 people. And 10's not a huge sample. We could go bigger than that, but I need to talk to a few people, start to gain sort of some background or knowledge. And then from sort of that learning agenda, you're able to then actually go into field. And I do recommend doing a little bit of reading. There isn't a lot of great reading, but how do you sort of minimize bias? How do you ask questions, open-ended questions, to make sure you're getting sort of full responses? Um, and there are the I think the marketplace also has changed for support, where it used to be these huge vendors that you would go to, and those big vendors sort of are ridiculously expensive. And it's good; they do great work, all that kind of stuff. But in the advent of, I'd say, the last 5 to 10 years, you've seen a lot more sort of individual people like me, that are sort of in the field, that are able to help at a much more affordable price. And there are also a lot more tools that are out there that you can get access to, that allow you to sort of DIY a lot of your research as well. And so that sort of kicks you off on that journey in consumer research.
I find that the most successful I've been in pitching projects has been when I come with data and I come with a story that's based in data or consumer insight. And it's just like, hey, this is what we're seeing, because it's a lot harder to argue with data. Well, I called you not too long ago and I had some quote and I can't remember it exactly, but it was like, um, if you have data, you never have to suffer the ignorance of other people or something like that,
Yes,
right?
yeah, exactly. And it's that same idea. When you start with the consumer first and saying, "Hey, here's what's happening," and then this is how we solve that. That's exactly that's how ideas are be able to you are to create that common knowledge or common understanding um, for the business.
What's your favorite kind of stuff to be doing? And I mean, there's so many different categories. You talked about innovation, competition. They're kind of like the main two categories that you focus in on, which is sort of like the front end and back end of this entire structure. But what's the stuff that you get really fired up, or what do you think is the most impactful and important of the stuff that you really get to deal with?
All is impactful depending on where you are in the journey. My two favorites are at the beginning and sort of the end of the process. And that beginning side is that creation of innovation, or what is the insight that will help drive business decisions from a marketing or product side at the end of the day. And I worked on like a recent project in order to understand holiday shopping and what are consumers thinking about in order to sort of market to them differently and bring product to market differently. And when you do that, it's kind of the mind melting moment where you're like, here's what consumers are thinking, here's the opportunities. People are like, oh, that's amazing. And then product people get to be product people, marketing people get to be marketing people. They know the problem to solve, they are great at solving problems, and then you get to see their creativity go, and be able to develop that. So I love that upfront and really that understanding of consumer in the beginning. um, and my tail end is actually the other place of understanding competition and white space opportunities for different brands, because that is also then understanding what are people doing with what they have, and then how do you sort of circle back to the problem that you're solving, and you get to see it at sort of a 30,000-foot level. Everything else in between, like to think of it as optimization. As much as I feel like I spend a lot of my life trying to optimize it. The it's good and it's helpful, and I'm happy to help there. But the really inspiring stuff is either end of the spectrum for me.
There's so many different directions we could take this entire discussion, and I guess what I want to know is what was the point at which you had your brain completely melted? Has there ever been a scenario where you've or an experience or an example that you've seen where we thought one thing and it was the complete opposite?
Regularly.
Okay.
The and that's the beauty of it is, um, I mean, I remember in previous roles, measuring marketplace and saying, "Hey, this isn't happening the way you wanted it to, etc." It's not. This is the fun part about what I get to do. It's not my fault. I didn't do it, but I'm telling you how consumers are reacting to it,
Yeah.
and as a result, you're seeing sort of this output at the end of the day that, of their reaction, that we need to understand. We need to be able to adapt to who those consumers are and those shifts. And so I've seen it sort of across the board of both. Like it lands, the insight tends to always do very well, but if you've been tracking without an insight and then you learn kind of like that mind melting moment at Red Bull, those are that's what I love. If I walk away from a presentation and people are like, I feel like I kind of already knew that the presentation failed, right? Like, but the vast majority of time when presenting, people walk away inspired. And that is so fun. Like, that is a great place to inspire people on what's happening and where to go next. That's the fun part.
It feels like you're giving people a really clear target to hit where they had a general idea of where they were tracking, but now you can say, oh, this is how we're going to, this is the problem that we really got to focus in on that's going to give us the most upside. Because I've got to imagine there's a lot of observations of like, oh, we should go over here and do this, or we should go over here and do this, or oh, our brand doesn't really do that kind of stuff, and we shouldn't do it because we haven't ever done it before. And then when you can present it in a way where it's like, this is actually a massive opportunity for you, and this could be the future. This is like the runway for the brand. That's got to be such a cool moment when you can give someone.
It is great. It's the because in order to be creative, right? If creative without any restraint, it 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 doesn't structure itself. Like, it's really hard to be creative without any restraint. Like, people just look like the white page and they don't know what to put down. The minute you put on constraints where you're like, you can only write a sentence a day, you're like, all of a sudden allow people to use that constraint to be creative with.
Mm.
This is a little bit of that constraint. It's like, here's what the consumer sort of wants and needs. All right, how might we solve that problem? Great. Now that's the impetus, or the opportunity to then solve for that thing.
I want to talk about challenger brands because I think a trend that we see, or it feels this way at least, is that there's a lot of really interesting brands that are kind of coming up and shaking the foundation of sort of these bigger brands that are out there. And then you potentially see these brands, taking inspiration from that. I'm being generous, and going down that path where it feels like from the outside they're letting these smaller brands do the research and develop, and then they're just tacking on to that. But also, like from Nike's perspective, they built that super shoe, and then fast forward however many years, other people had super shoes too. I'd love to hear you kind of talk about how the the other companies in the space influence this market research, influence the consumer insights, and sort of the trends itself, and kind of how that plays out.
Yeah. The I'm gonna back up a little bit too, a little bit further on that of let's talk about what the challenges are if you don't perform consumer research. And there are kind of two that end up coming up. And one is companies look to preserve the problem for which they are the solution. They want to stick with doing what they've been doing because they've been successful at it, and they don't want to shift, even though the consumer is shifting. Think of Fujifilm and the film and creating sort of film that goes into cameras. They didn't want to shift to digital. They stuck with film, and that became sort of a massive problem for them. Blockbuster's another example of going from not going digital, right? Like they just wanted to continue to produce DVDs or et cetera, or rent them. Um, and so they end up being caught off guard, and they don't catch up to where everybody's going, and that's where these competitor brands come in, and they start showing you that there's a new place. The other challenge that we often see is that companies become echo chambers. And so there's either a strong founder leader, or there's a team of leaders that have a strong belief on where everything should go, or even who the consumer is without doing the research. And everybody listens and everybody follows in line, and they start saying the same thing. And you start to see the company move actually away from the consumer, because it's sort of answering the needs of, instead of starting with the consumer first, they're starting actually with an opinion founder or whatnot first. And so that leads everybody astray in this process. Until let's go back to challenger brands. I think that's largely what you've been seeing with the bigger brands in our marketplace, is that they have largely become echo chambers, and people are sort of feeding off what they know internally without a lot of sort of external research and understanding what's evolving with the consumer. And so I'll just take Hoka and On as two examples. Coming out of COVID, yeah, now these brands that already existed, already producing comfortable shoes, but especially coming out of COVID, they saw that need and connection of consumers to enjoy working out. Working out doesn't have to be hard. People are looking for comfort. They're looking for comfortable clothes. It's why Viore is doing well, etc. And they played into that. Hoka's got very comfortable, high stack footwear for people. On's very much playing the technology space of that comfort side, but we didn't see that same thing coming necessarily from Adidas or Nike, etc. They weren't necessarily chasing into that consumer opportunity, and so what you saw is these brands come in and do that, and now everybody's sort of paying attention, right? Like it starts to um, they're starting to recognize it and see it for what it is, and try to also then play in that space. And that's why I think you look at the new Peg that just launched. It looks like it looks very comfortable. Like, how do they play that direction? So it's interesting to see those smaller brands are working off of some sort of research that they've done. Again, it could be founder being the ultimate user of it, power user, or they've done some sort of research to understand that's filling a niche for consumers. And then these brands are sort of chasing it as a defensive move.
How do brands, or how should they react in the case that they basically get caught out? Like, what would somebody at Nike be looking at right now, or what would be, maybe more appropriately, what's the question that they should or probably are asking internally to the insights team at this very moment?
So I like to think of it as an offense and defense. Like, in order to be in a successful brand that is a large brand, you need to be both on the offense, play strong offense, and you need to play strong defense. And that strong offense is really driving innovation, right? And driving a good pipeline, so that, for example, when everybody has a carbon plated running super shoe, like, what's the next thing? Like, you should be already pumping that through the pipeline so that you're continuing to evolve the market, and you're the market leader of pushing it forward, because everybody's going to catch up. It's kind of like bike racing. For everybody that bike races, if you're not moving forward, you're moving backward. It's that same idea. You need to be pushing forward all the time. That being said, you also have to play strong defense. And this goes back to why market research is really important from the competitive perspective. It's looking at those other brands and seeing what's resonating, what's connected, what did your current brand miss? And can then you also chase that opportunity? For example, Look at what Under Armour did with base layer. They got men to wear spandex, which back then was unheard of, right? Like, and we called it spandex back then, right? Like that was literally what it was. Um, and uh, and that ends up being a huge opportunity for both Adidas and Nike, sort of building their business. But you got to be able to recognize it and chase into that business fairly quickly, so that you can limit the size and growth of these other companies. If you don't, I think what you're seeing is what's happening in the marketplace now. You've seen these small brands of Brooks, Hoka, On, all become over $1 billion brand, right, in sales. Like they have become very large because they brands have not necessarily been playing a strong defense against them. And so you need to be able to do both of those things effectively.
I wonder what the insight was, and maybe you have some inside knowledge on this, but I feel like one of the things that made the Under Armour thing work was that they had base layers in the colors that matched your team jerseys. And so do you think the insight was, hey, let's make an additional piece of apparel that will match team colors, and it just happens to be spandex because that's an area that's not being, did we really need a base layer, or did we need another piece of clothing that matched our team colors? What do you think it was that actually drove that to open up?
Yeah, I think there are actually a lot of things on the Under Armour side. I think the first, if I was to say where it foundationally started, was like, how do we reduce the friction of pads against our skin, right? Like pads were not comfortable to wear as a football player, a lax player, etc. And it gave them something to wear underneath. It also made people who were fairly fit look even fitter, right? Like they was like really tight, and when you took it off, like everybody looked jacked in it, and that created this like, oh wow, like that's what the fit people are wearing. It sort of creates this. Now, what creates expansion is, all right, I get to be the same but different. Now, I think that's the insight that you see it all the time with consumers. I want to fit in and I want to stand out. And so the team colors creates that. I want to fit in and have Under Armour, but I'm going to stand out because I'm going to have my team colors. Um, think of it like dunks. Consumers largely are purchasing dunks in order to be part of that style trend, but they're choosing different colors in order to stand out. You look at with Adidas Samba, the same thing. I think there's this interesting human nature that we have. And so I think color very much plays a role in how that happens. But the observation is people are buying different colors. The insight is people want to fit in and stand out. And so how might we create something that allows people to fit in and stand out
How
and be
might we?
different? How might we?
That's
Yeah.
such a powerful thing to kind of set up the insight and set up the discussion around solving problems and finding problems to solve. Do you have any favorite case studies? I mean, the Under Armour one's a great one, absolutely. Are there others that kind of stand out, or that are sort of like really well-known case studies that people could probably learn a lot from?
I mean, they're everywhere, around us all the time. We don't get a lot of visibility into them, so oftentimes they end up being guesses unless they sort of share them. So I recommend, if you want to hear good stories, go to the what's the remind me, the NPR podcast
Oh, How
about
I Built
how
This.
I built this. That is a great way to find out where insights come from. And if it doesn't sound like an insight is, or if there isn't a research that's there, just ask yourself, how did this person know that there was a challenge there? And that answer within it is exactly where the the research was done.
That's a really great way to kind of tee up how to dig for the insights. And I've got to assume a big part of your work too is really kind of evaluating that, like how to get to that insight and how to ask the right questions, because there are probably right and wrong questions that are being asked.
That's exactly right. That's where you need a little bit of help sometimes. And that help can come in, again, two forms. Can we train people in how to perform basic effective research? That's great. That we should be doing at every company. We should be empowering our people to be able to go and talk to consumers and understand what their problems and challenges are. That being said, there are times when you need more expertise to come in. And if you start to do very complicated things like try to understand pricing and what should we be charging, so there's analytical models that allow you to do that. That's where you bring in an expert that has sort of that background that can kind of help and facilitate that. So there's this training will take you to let's say fluency or competency. But there is this need also for mastery at times when people get out over their skis.
So is that some of the stuff that you do with your business too? Do you go in and kind of train up a group of people on how to ask the right questions, how to look for the right piece of information, and then sort of what to do with it?
Yes, and so I actually perform a bunch of different things, and there are a lot of people that kind of are all in different parts of this process. But um, one, how do you help train those people? That's I've got workshops that we after spending 6 years of teaching at the University of Oregon consumer research, like being able to take that and help other companies do that because they haven't necessarily had that experience or background. And when companies are sort of potentially out over their skis or they need some solutions, I'm helping companies at the moment sort of set up their consumer research practice. Like, how do you develop a learning agenda? And you can do some training as you go through this process. But what tools should you be sort of using in order to be able to make decisions better? Um, and then, sort of on the tail end, how do you do that consumer research? That is the more complicated research, and can you sort of help and support people throughout that process? So I kind of sort of help along that spectrum.
I brought this up on we did a podcast with Simon Freeman not too long ago, and one of the questions or one of the things that I was kind of testing with them was, do you think that, social media influencers and content creators are being utilized by brands all the time to, create meta ads and to do partnership and collab posts and all this stuff? And you do get a decent amount of information from how well they perform, what's the audience, what are the comments that are being added in. But part of me wonders if brands are either rightfully so or mistakenly using that insight for, because we hear it a lot of times where people are like, "Oh, there's no way to tell if this worked." And that must drive you insane. But do you think it's useful for people to use some level of feedback and data from, say, an Instagram post to as qualitative or quantitative insight? Or how would you have that conversation with a brand that was like, "Hey, we have insight, here's our Instagram"?
Yeah. The the first place I would start is actually trying to understand what is the problem that they're trying to solve, right? Like, are they trying to sort of gain broader reach? Are they looking to actually engage people more? So where are they in that funnel in order to then to help answer that question? And um, absolutely, like especially when comes to data, there's a ton of information out there. The challenge is sort of how do you sort of bring it together in order to understand what's happening. And we talked about before having adequate sample size to some degree. Seeing a post can be dangerous, right? Like a single response on a single post and using that as your proof of hypothesis is a common pitfall we see in the marketplace,
Mhm.
that everybody gets stuck on this one thing one person said. What you need to make sure is that that's not the only person who believes that, and that actually multiple people have that. So you can either use NLP, natural language processing, and scrape all of this and start using social in order to say, hey, here are the keywords, themes, etc., that are coming out. AI is going to change our entire industry, based on how we're able to leverage a lot of that information. Because before AI, in order to see open ends or what people are commenting, the best we were kind of doing, let's say 5 years ago, was um, taking all of that and aggregating, is it positive messaging and what are some of the keywords people are using? But AI is actually going to be able to go in and go deeper and say, hey, here are the key themes, trends, etc., that are popping out of what we're seeing in all of the social feeds. Like, let's take yours, and how's that comparing to a different brands versus another brands, and how do these themes pop out that we can then sort of chase into to help support. But again, a lot of that information is going to help you execute marketing better. Um, And sometimes if you get where you get more of the product side is if you go to things like YouTube reviews. So somebody will, the Ginger Runner will review some trail footwear on his channel, and then a lot of people respond back in YouTube of like, "Hey, here are my thoughts of impressions." That
Mhm.
is deep, rich content that you're able to mine and be able to then sort of feed back to the top and say, some of it's observational, like, hey, we need to change the laces or the outsoles coming off. Like that's some of it's basic, but some of it you may start to see a little bit more that will help feed hypotheses of insights like, hey, people are looking for more cushion. Everybody keeps coming up that, "Look, maybe there's something about cushioning that we need to research, right? Like, is it really about more cushioning or is it about a comfortable ride or is it just going about shorter distances? What is the nature of humans that we need to understand in order to build that product for them?"
Music to my ears. YouTube is the way to go. I mean, yeah, I see it all the time. I've learned so much from reading the comments on the videos that I put out, and it's given me some direction. It's given me something to work with, some insights that I think would be valuable. And I think that's a big reason why we will likely see more creators and athletes developing brands and products because they're on the front line of getting that qualitative research, getting that insight directly from the consumers and hearing it from the people that would most most likely to support them, right?
Absolutely. And what I love about what you shared is you may not consider yourself a consumer researcher, or you may not think that you're doing consumer research, but that is research, right? Like, and you are actually potentially really sophisticated, and other people are as well in the space that it's a lot of test and learn, right? Like we're gonna test this, see how it performs. We're gonna test this and see how it performs. Not necessarily A/B testing. You could A/B test it if you wanted it. But you're trying to rapidly evolve in that testing process, and you're using research in terms of how people are responding to evolve to meet what their need is.
It's interesting to think about second nature in this because one of the insights we kept getting comments from people saying, I always feel like I'm running down the street and or in the woods and I just want to have one more thing to add to what you guys were talking about. I love this conversation, but I have one more thing that I want to include. And we took that, we kept hearing it over and over and over. And we thought, how might we continue this conversation with our audience in a meaningful way? And that's what led to, what if we put a Slack channel together where people could come in and continue the conversation and share even more and make it a safe place? It's not wide open like LinkedIn, but you could really connect one on one with people. You could really have deep discussions. You could share your honest opinions in sort of like a safe space. That would be the way that we could potentially solve for this.
And look what
And
happened.
600 plus people in there
It's
having
and it's a
meaningful
great
discussions.
community. Yeah, it's amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like that's exactly it. That's the trying to understand the consumer what they want and then building that how might we and seeing where it takes you.
What are the places that you, as a complete market research nerd, in the most loving way I'm saying this, but like, where are the places where like the nerds are hanging out? Like, where are you getting your best information or just articles or stuff is being surfaced that you find really fascinating?
Yeah, so there are a lot of trade side of things that gets really intense. That what's funny is the market researchers are like market researchers. Like they love market research. It's not necessarily about the product, like they are just into the methodology, etc. And so there are a bunch of conferences that you could go to and all that kind of stuff. What I feel like is missing in the marketplace, and this is my consumer research on consumer research, is there isn't something for the everyday people. Like again, the merchants, the merchandisers, the product people, the branding people, the designers. There isn't the translation of how people can commonly use it. So a lot of the conversations when you go to these conferences are really deep and really intense about sort of methodologies, about really hard um, different methods that you could use. But nobody's breaking it down to what's the easy thing. And I think the where people are filling in are some of the tools recently, and different providers of tools are providing interesting information to people. But I actually think it's a gap for us in the industry that we could sort of helpful. And I'm trying to fill in as I can. But that's the opportunity. It's the but yeah, the research conferences are almost too deep for everybody if you are not in consumer research.
That's job security for you then.
I hope so. It seems to be working. Yeah.
That's so cool. This has been really interesting, and I feel like I've taken like the introductory uh market research consumer insights 101 here in your
I mean,
your
I got
college.
30 hours, so we could go through.
Yeah. No, this is
There's
really
a lot
helpful.
we could dive into.
What do you want to leave people? Because I think we did a similar podcast where we kind of Jonathan Levitt came in and broke down performance marketing for a lot of people, and that's probably one of the episodes that gets referenced the most frequently. Of like, oh, I learned so much from that, and I feel like this is kind of in that same vein of like, let's talk about this stuff, which is sort of like people don't really have a good grasp on it. But if there's one thing that you want kind of everybody to take away from today's discussion, what do you want to leave them with?
I think the main thing I would leave everybody with is if is to watch as you're having conversations, as you go into meetings. If you go into meetings and you're not leading with the consumer in your presentation or how you're giving feedback on product or marketing or design, um, that to some degree is a flag for you, and to say, hey, if I'm not confident enough to lead with what the consumer thinks or believes, I should probably go figure that out. And that will lead you on a great journey. I mean, email me, everybody, if you want to figure out what to do next. I'm happy to provide some advice. But that's my interesting one for everybody to watch for. And if they sort of have a hard time with that, seek help.
I think that was you on a previous podcast. We did the 2025 predictions pod, and I think one of the things that really stood out to a lot of the listeners of that episode particularly was that you led the predictions with consumer insights. This is what the consumer, not what the brands are trying to do, but what the consumer is looking for, and that feels like the exact right way to kind of couch the entire discussion.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting to be that point in the episode we switch over to BPC. Do you have a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
you got a good brand product or content for today?
Uh,
I
let
can
me
go
think.
I can go
You go
first if you
first.
want.
You go
Okay.
first.
This may end up being a little bit of a diatribe. So today, Brandon Semenuk dropped a video called La La Land on his YouTube channel. Brandon Semenuk is a once in a generational mountain bike talent who has won Red Bull Rampage, who many, many times has won every mountain bike event that you could possibly win in slopestyle. This guy is just something special. But what I think is the most important thing is that this video and many other videos that will absolutely take over the mountain bike landscape for like the next week or so is on his channel, not on Red Bull's channel, not on SRAM's channel or Trek's channel. And Brandon was smart in that he built his own production company to create his videos. He knows that when he puts out a video, the mountain bike internet is going to stop and pay attention. And there's a lot of value inherent in kind of owning it like Oprah. Not only that, the whole video is him in his backyard. So he didn't even have to leave his house to go to some location to film, and brands are investing in making that space better. So brands are like, hey, do you need this for your backyard? You need some resources to do this. So he has completely changed the direction that this relationship is going, where up until this point, athletes have had to put themselves out there to appear on brand channels or to appear on media channels within their space. And by creating this sort of runway of, hey, we can actually put this on our channel and it will do better, but it's like my stuff. And you get to kind of own the entire process end to end. And you get the brands investing in you because it's a lever for them to pull, but it's also has like a meaningful upside for you as an athlete. There's something special, and I've been screaming this into the void for a very long time of like why athletes need to have it. This is exactly why. And you see the same thing with Ronaldo. He started his own YouTube channel, so now he controls the conversation. Oh, did you want to do a video project with me? Great. Would you like to put it on one of the top 3 sports channels in the world on YouTube? Great. That's me. Come on over here. I'll cash the check and I will do it for you. As opposed to being like, where do I need to show up to do this thing that you're going to get all the benefit from? I think the long-term value of athletes really truly owning their own platforms and having the brands invest in them as the platform is the future. And I think that athletes that don't figure this out are going to miss out in a pretty major way. And also, it's not just a one sided thing for the athletes, the brands benefit substantially from this as well, especially when you're building long term relationships with those athletes. So, I don't think that Red Bull or SRAM or Trek are losing out by not having this one clip, because at the end of the day, I think that the consumer, the people that are watching this stuff, the value gets spread across in the end. Like, oh, that's a Trek rider, Red Bull rider, SRAM athlete. Like, people still connect the dots on that stuff. It's just like when, the internal side of Red Bull is like, oh, we have this region, this region, this region. The consumer has no idea that that exists. All they want is a cold beverage that's going to wake them up and get them ready to go run 100 miles or whatever. And it's the same thing when it comes to content. We don't need to be so precious about like this being on the brand's channel if it's done the right way.
Yeah. It's kind of goes back to the idea of the research and insights of people want to have relationships with other people. And I think sometimes brands get a little confused by that because they think they're going to be friends with everybody, right? And people love them like they love people, and people love brands. Don't get me wrong. Like there's a deep passion. Like I spent 8 years tracking that for Nike. There's a strong affinity and connection, but they aren't necessarily people. And that that simple fact is that people will follow other people. Um, and brands can lean into those other people to help them. It's just a different form than what we've seen in the past. Typically, that's pretty cool. That's a good one.
What you got?
I'm gonna go with Half Days. To be honest, Half Days is a ski apparel brand. I wrote about it recently for those of you that read my Substack. But they're a brand that focuses on ski apparel for women. And what I appreciate about what they're doing is that they are looking at the marketplace a little bit differently. If you look at all the top brands, and when we talk about crowded outdoor brands, if you look at all the ski coat companies, they're all largely playing sort of in that top of mountain, is I'll call it, where everybody's sort of climbing something big or doing something extreme or seems sort of really out there, and almost unattainable. That worked really well in the past, and it can work really well for many brands. But when everybody's playing at top of mountain, brands like Half Days are playing at mid mountain, where people are actually performing the activity that they're doing. And let's, for example, this is skiing. It's a great product, keeps you dry, keeps you warm, right? Like it's stylish. It allows women to feel like they look like women instead of feeling like they look like men and having to have their hair out in order to identify that they're actually a woman. That's connecting with people differently in the marketplace, and I appreciate what they're doing. So just a shout out to them on the brand and product side.
That's very cool. I had a pod with Cassie Abel, who founded Wild Rye, and they
Yo,
make
that was a great one. That's another great brand to bring up.
the interesting point that she made on that discussion was she was working with brands and doing some consulting, and had been talking about women's apparel for mountain biking and skiing. And she said there was sort of like this catch 22 where it's like they didn't really put effort into making good stuff that women would actually wear, so then women weren't buying stuff because it was basically trash. And my words, not hers. but it's sort of this loop where it's like, well, you didn't make the good stuff, so then the market doesn't respond, so that must mean that women don't want to wear good looking gear when they're out on the mountain riding or skiing, and so we should not explore that category. And she basically proved them wrong by being like, I'm going to make stuff that actually looks good and fits me instead of just this like,
Shrink it and pink it.
right,
That,
exactly.
yeah, doesn't work.
And so it's like an interesting problem that you see quite often, where it's like, oh, well, yeah, we haven't seen a lot of people buy this from that category, so we're not even going to try to dip our toe in it because it appears that there isn't anything, when in reality you haven't made anything for them yet, and so of course they're not going to respond. It's a kind of weird in between, right?
Exactly. You haven't done the research to begin with to understand what that want and need is. It's a hypothesis projection that it's top of mountain for all of these people, when actually there's sets of people that want something different out of their product. Um, What I loved about that episode too is it continues to remind me, I think I keep thinking about women's outdoors and why there isn't more, Wild Ride. Like why are we not doing more as brands to help service women? And I think there's this interesting thing that's happening on the women's side where it's almost like the ecosystem, and it brings me back to your conversation about getting women into Red Bull Rampage. This is where it really started, is that you need a full ecosystem in order to sort of propagate the the production and sales of different products, right? You need elite athletes at the top, but it's been hard to sort of create that same level playing field. And without it, then you don't have sort of this drive of new people to come in to sort of replicate that. And if you don't have the drive of new people that are coming in to replicate that, then you don't have that same mass of potential buyers of product or people going to retailers and asking for this product. And so it creates this interesting loop that in I wonder if for this is just a how might we instead of thinking about just creating women's product, how might we create a better ecosystem for women in the outdoors that will then create this sort of virtuous cycle that will then actually create more events. It will create more opportunities for product sales. It will create more demand at retail, which will create more stores. And how do you start to spin this flywheel? That's what I liked about Wild Ride and what their sponsorship of Rampage is helping propagate that. But I think I wonder if there's more we can do as an industry to not just try to solve one piece, but how do we try to work on all of the pieces together?
How do you get to that point where, at the time there wasn't data, but it felt like like a observation of like, there's a big market here to tap into. There is a big opportunity. But we have no data because there's never been any sales. There's never been a product like this. Does it, does it require a singular founder to be sort of like the first polar bear or the first penguin into the water?
Sometimes it's like a back to the test and learn, right? Like Wild Ride to some degree is testing and learning, right? And as they see it and they see, hey, we need mountain bike specific women's apparel. We do need specific ski apparel. Each time that creates proof, and in the more that we are able to create that and actually get people on mountain in either form and people see it, then it starts to create this network effect, right? And more people are using it. But I think we've got to be able to do that in events as well. Like, how are we promoting events, and how do we get people to show that that it's equal? The people that are lining up are equal men and women at start lines, right? But a lot of times we see the first person that crosses the line, which sometimes more often than not is male, and they're like, that's it. You're like, oh, like that's kind of wah wah, right? When the only time we don't is when Courtney DeWalter beats all of the men
Yeah.
in the race, right? And that's a big deal. But we need to be celebrating everybody equally in order to show that it is an inclusive sport for all. Um, I don't know. I'm really big into this network effect to build and prove out the need for more. And I will just say there's more research we should be doing on women on what their specific needs are that are different than men. Again, we cannot think of Shrink It and Pink It. We cannot think like the same needs are there. Like there are very specific needs, but there's also specific style and taste, etc., that allow better connection to women.
Gosh, I feel like the discussion to have is like the opportunity of this, not only for the people to participate, but for the businesses themselves. There has to be a giant interest, and they're overlooking this opportunity as well. And I'm glad that people like Cassie and Wild Rye are actually able to capture the value and build businesses off this. I think that's great. I want that. I'd rather.
They're taking the bets that the big brands won't take, right? Because they're so small that there isn't the return on investment for these big brands. So I love that she's doing that. Like I love the Half Days is doing that. I love um, Avali's creating footwear for volleyball players for women. They're filling in the gaps that these big brands leave open because of their return on investment, and it's a proof of concept. And potentially it will snowball as these brands start to gain momentum.
Yeah. It'd be great. And hopefully they get that first mover advantage and get to hold on to it. But there is definitely a big impact for when those big brands get off the bench and the opportunities for people in that space to grow and rise with the tide of everybody then being in it, from both the athletes and creators in that space as well as the other brands. They they really got the ball rolling, and hopefully they continue to just get tons and tons of value out of this whole thing. So it's interesting to watch. But yeah, I want to see everybody get off the bench and start doing some amazing stuff.
Yeah, same.
Wow. Well, my brain is melted. I would imagine there are a couple thousand people
I
out
took
there
you
that are
on a
feeling the
lot
same
of
way.
different journeys. A lot of analogies in there. It was fun to talk about though, and I'm happy to chat about it anytime.
Cool. Amazing. Well, thank you for this. And yeah, thanks for all the insight that you shared on previous pods and the future ones that you'll likely will as well. I'm
Yeah,
super
absolutely.
stoked to have you in our crew.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks.